In an unprecedented experience aimed at understanding the impact of the nuclear explosion on the human being, a distant desert site was chosen to be the test field. On this arid site, an integrated infrastructure has been created that mimics the conditions that a person can be exposed to in the event of a nuclear disaster. The aim of this experiment was to understand the immediate and direct effects of the nuclear explosion on the human body, in addition to studying long-term repercussions of nuclear radiation. Before starting the test, human dolls are equipped with advanced sensors to measure various physical and chemical effects to which the body is exposed during the explosion. These dolls were made of substances that mimic the skin, muscles, and human bones, and they were distributed in various locations of the explosion area to know the extent of the human body being affected by the distance and strength directed. Scientists began analyzing the biological and physical data of man to determine the most vulnerable points when exposed to the tremendous force of a nuclear explosion. Biological systems such as the heart, lungs, and nervous system have been studied, as these organs play a decisive role in human life. Through this analysis, scientists managed to determine the most vulnerable points in the body and expected possible scenarios for the effect of the explosion. When the moment of explosion arrived, the atmosphere was charged with tension and anticipation. After the bomb was activated, the countdown began, and as the number reached 0, a huge fireball erupted in the sky, turning night into day. The explosion was so rapid and devastating that everything in its surroundings was instantly affected. At that moment, the human dummies faced an unparalleled force. The shock waves generated by the explosion traveled at an incredible speed, exceeding the speed of sound, and collided with the human bodies with overwhelming force. The impact of these waves was devastating. It caused tissue to tear and bones to splinter, turning the bodies into tiny pieces in an instant. These effects were precisely measured using sensors installed on the dummies, and the data showed how vulnerable the human body was to this type of explosion. In addition to the powerful shock waves that caused massive destruction, the heat generated by the nuclear explosion was no less deadly. Once the bomb went off, the temperature at the center of the explosion rose to an unprecedented level, exceeding thousands of degrees Celsius in less than a second. In that brief, terrifying moment, the surrounding environment was transformed into a blazing inferno, where no form of life could withstand the intense heat. Human tissues instantly absorbed this heat, causing it to evaporate within fractions of a second. There was no way to survive or even escape, as the heat spread so rapidly, sweeping away everything in its path. Human bodies, which were close to the center of the explosion, no longer existed in the usual sense, but were instead turned into ashes scattered in the air, leaving behind barely visible remains. But it wasn't just human bodies. This immense heat caused everything in the vicinity of the explosion to ignite, turning the entire area into a sea of flames. Trees, buildings, and everything else made of flammable materials caught fire in an instant, adding to the scale of the disaster. Even materials that were normally considered non-flammable, such as metals and glass, were not immune to this heat. Under the influence of these extreme conditions, metals began to melt and glass to fuse, forming small lakes of liquid lava that further devastated the surrounding environment. Everything in the area of the explosion became part of this hellish scene, where there was no longer any difference between different materials. They all melted under the enormous temperatures released by the explosion. This disaster was comprehensive, leaving no trace of life or infrastructure behind. This experience showed us the enormity of the destructive power of nuclear weapons and their ability to wipe out everything in a few moments, reminding us of how vulnerable humans and nature are to such deadly disasters.